5. Why don't we go ahead and get started? And those who may not be able to make it here in person can catch the recording because this is being recorded. So it's going to be up on the website. So for those who are here, welcome this afternoon. I'd like to introduce our guest speaker today. Cliff Feldheim is a wildlife biologist. He's got over 30 years of experience working as a biologist in the Central Valley of California. He's a senior biologist with California Trout, the nonprofit organization where he works to conserve salmon and other species through habitat restoration, implementation, and management projects, and also doing scientific research. And today Mr. Feldheim is going to be talking to us about the effects of climate change and salmon. So with that, please take it away.
Yeah, thank you, Russ. So I'm going to talk a little bit here about focus on salmon, a little about their biology, the different runs of salmon we have, and the impacts of climate change. And Russ introduced me a little bit. I'm a fish and wildlife biologist. Did my bachelor's of science and master's degree at what's now Cal Poly Humboldt State University. And most of my work in the Central Valley has focused on birds and fish and bringing those two things together. They share a lot of the same habitats along our river valleys, the floodplain habitats that historically occurred in the valley that we manage for now. So I spent a lot of time working with those critters. So enjoy talking about salmon. So California salmon, we essentially have 4 species that occur in the state. That's Chinook or king salmon, coho or silver salmon, and then to a much lesser extent, pink and chum salmon. And these species mostly occur in the northwest corner of the state near the Oregon border. Chinook salmon is the most abundant salmon species in the state, using our coastal rivers and then going up through the Sacramento River, Central Valley. Coho or silver salmon, historically very abundant in our northern rivers along the coast. Moving inland, their populations have gone down dramatically. And I say the pink salmon occur near the Oregon border, and there's probably only 1 or 2 self-sustaining populations left. They used to be much more abundant. We suspect the populations now are a result of strays, if you will, from Oregon and Washington. And and the pink, what did I put there? Oh, the chum salmon are so low that they can't be detected anymore in the state. So we basically lost those 2 runs of salmon, those 2 species from the state already. And the challenge now is how to conserve really coho and chinook in the face of these changes. And just to set the stage as we talk about salmon and the impacts, I think it's important to recognize their life cycle. So if we start there on the right-hand side, the eggs are hatching in the river. In our salmon are cold water species, so they're coming in from the ocean, historically going up into the mountains to spawn in our cold water in the main rivers, and then lots of tributaries. Now with all the dams and water diversions we have, there's very little of that left. And they either run into dams and have hatcheries, or they have very limited access in places like the Upper Sacramento River, Trinity River, those little, I'll say, tributaries off there, Battle Creek and Butte Creek. Yuba River has a little bit of spawning habitat, but so they're starting in the rivers, moving down as small fish, entering the Pacific Ocean, and then spending anywhere from 1 to 3 years, sometimes 4 or 5 years in the ocean before they return back up the rivers. And as they move up the rivers, their physiology changes. They change from these silver fish to, the really red color. Some of them get humps in the back. Lots of changes as they move upriver. And then their spawning habitat, which is really limited throughout these rivers, is gravel beds. gravel beds where they can deposit eggs, and the eggs can stick to the rocks, get down in between the rocks to get away from things that eat them, and then start that life cycle all over again. So in the face of climate change, you can already see that there's a lot of opportunity for impacts in these different life stages. So salmon are unique among our fish species in that they really do need cold water. So ocean fish that are returning upriver, um, they need the cold water to lay their eggs. They also need a key component for their survival is what I'm calling off-channel habitats. So if you think of these fish need to eat and the water's moving constantly in the river, let's say it's moving downstream, they need to find areas where they can get out of that current, out of that stream, and have food available to them so they can have, if you will, that residence time to eat the food because the food is moving by them. So they need that diversity of different channel habitats. And the adults and eggs, again, need cold water. And historically, our fish followed those patterns of rainfall and flooding, again, using those important floodplain habitats. So the fish would hold up in areas, say in deep pools or along the coast, say the North Coast, hold out in our bays and estuaries, waiting for a big storm and increased flow in the river, use that as a cue, and then start heading upstream. So very much cueing in on the different hydrological patterns and using that both as inward migration and then back the young moving out. So the young hatch and they're feeding and hanging out, basically waiting for that high water again, whether that's in the fall, the winter, or the spring, and following that out to the ocean. So very correlated with the different flows with flooding historically. And that leads us to, I'm going to lump steelhead in here with salmon in this discussion, simply because their biology is the same, being anadromous, going out to the ocean and coming back inland on our rivers. And so California is unique. Really, nowhere else in the world has the 4 runs of salmon that we have. Really, one could say we have 5 runs. We have a spring run, a fall run, a late fall run, and a winter run. And the run is when those young fish are going back out to the ocean. So with that in mind, you could see that any time of the year we could have salmon in our rivers. You know, there's pulses with these different runs, but fish are hatching at different times. And so they're very sensitive to those changes in flow, changes in temperature, all throughout the year. And steelhead, we have 2 runs, a summer run and a winter run. And our California steelhead really is a coastal variation of a rainbow trout. They're the same species of rainbow trout, but they're anadromous. So the flip side of that is a rainbow trout is the landlocked version of a steelhead. And I'm including them, like I say, because their biology is very similar and they're the same family of salmons, salmonoids, salmonidae. So they're all in the same family and have these same impacts and declining populations along the coast. So to set the stage for the climate change predictions, I think it's important to first say what these assumptions and uncertainties are. And one of the things we really don't know at this point, we know that we're on this trajectory of change. These changes are already starting to occur, but we don't know how people are going to respond, how countries and societies are going to respond to this at this point. And I'm laying out 3 simple scenarios. Humans will not change their actions at all, which would be more extreme impacts from climate change. Some countries change and others don't, which will be a little bit less of those impacts. And some would argue the ideal change is that everyone jumps on board and makes the changes to reduce these emissions and these climate change causing impacts. And then we get the lower end of these these impacts, if you will. So we don't know. One of the challenges we face as scientists is we just don't know how society and countries are going to respond to these things and when they're going to respond, the timing of that. So it's really difficult to predict the extent of these impacts. And ultimately, what we've already seen is that this will impact fish and their habitats in many ways, and some we don't understand, and some will be positive and some will be negative. And so it's essential that as scientists and biologists right now, we're setting up monitoring to understand baseline conditions and understand when these changes occur. So what are the basic climate change predictions and impacting salmon? First, higher average temperatures, both day and night temperatures. Sea level rise, with that increased salinity, so that the ocean salinity will get higher and it will go further inland and get into groundwater. So more intrusion inland, if you will. Longer lasting droughts. So our dry periods will be more extreme, last for longer periods of time. With that, coupled with that is more intense wildfires. So more frequently and bigger fires, excuse me, and stronger, more extreme storms. And with all that, shifting seasonal temperatures and rainfall patterns. We can see a little bit of that this year, where spring didn't really seem to come and winter came at a different time. And we have to, if you will, let go of these preconceived ideas of when our calendar says it's supposed to be spring and when winter's supposed to end, as these temperatures and rainfall patterns shift. And what does that mean for fish? Well, our changes in rainfall and snow patterns, increased storm intensity, and longer droughts will really impact stream flow and river flows. And the predictions range from low flows decreasing by as much as 75% and high flows increasing by as much as 60%. So again, more extremes where it's really, really high, fast water for long periods, and for at times a year where it didn't normally occur, like we see this year. And then in those dry conditions, really, really low flows that we maybe saw once every 25 years will be much more common. And again, depending on how we as a society respond to these impacts that we're having on the climate. So with increases in stream flows, we will see these peak flows change in volume and in season, and really disrupt that life cycle of salmon. These young fish, how they respond to very low temperatures, very low flows, high temperature water, high water, just really, really impacting how these fish use that habitat. And in some cases, these high waters, if the fish can get in there and spawn, will destroy their nests. Ultimately, too, reducing that habitat complexity and flushing young salmon out of protected areas, flushing them downstream, and really increasing their chances of getting eaten by other fish and birds. Just changing that whole dynamic. I talk about that off-channel habitat, that need to get out of flow, and this increase in stream flow will really remove all those opportunities. Everything that's there now will be completely washed out. So huge impacts. The reduced flows, the biggest impact there will be an increase in water temperature. As it slows down, as it's shallower, there'll be more thermal energy to heat up the water. And as I mentioned, the young and eggs in particular require cold water. So that will reduce both the amount of spawning habitat available, and then in areas where fish were able to spawn when they could get there, will result in dying fish and eggs that aren't fertile. Sea level rise and salt intrusion is a little more complicated for salmon in particular. Um, some of the models, the most recent models, suggest along our coast um, a more conservative, say humans respond in a positive way to how we're affecting the climate. Um, about a maximum of about 2 feet rise in sea level by 2050. The other side of the spectrum, anywhere from a foot to 3.5 feet, basically by 2100. So increasing by 3 feet along the coast. Again, these fish that are coming in our rivers, the mouths of the rivers. Um, well, I think, yeah, these fish that gather in the bays or the estuaries. You can see in this picture. This is a good picture of these fish habitats where the fish come in off the ocean. They kind of just congregate right there in that little estuary. You can see the river is, if you will, toward the top of the screen in that picture. You can see a little bit of flow. So they're hanging out in the estuary, waiting for the right flows to come in there, and then they'll move upstream. And if, even a 6-inch rise and definitely a 3-foot rise of sea level will completely wash out those habitats. That estuary won't function as an estuary. The salt water will get into the river, really changing those habitats, and the plants and animals that use them will need to then be salt tolerant. So changing all the species that use there. So dramatic impacts on those coastal habitats and these fish's ability to use them. With that, that I mentioned, the increased salinity, and that's one we're trying to really get a handle on how that salinity will move inland, areas that it will intrude groundwater and then seep up into creeks and some of our off-channel habitats that are shallow. The groundwater isn't too far away, and the salinity will basically come up into those habitats and move them from freshwater to saltwater habitats. Again, changing the plants, changing the abundance of food for these fish. So our rivers are already pretty much a food desert, and adding salinity to them is going to get rid of the rest of the food that these fish could eat. So huge impacts on our fish from a food availability standpoint. And the results for our young fish will be very similar, with reduced growth rates and survival. And again, with all that increased temperature, both ambient and water temperature, I think that's probably, we talk about the Central Valley right now. That's one of the biggest threats we have currently to salmon. The eggs and young just don't survive in higher temperature water. And we had that, last 2 years ago, last 2 years, we've had huge fish kills already, in the order of magnitude of 10,000 to 30,000 fish in the upper Sacramento River, because it just got too warm. And we didn't have the ability to get that water colder. So that's going to be more and more a problem, and really the one of the biggest impacts to our native fish. I mentioned increased wildfires. One of the biggest threats to our steelhead and salmon as a result of these fires is the soil erosion and runoff that results from that. So you burn away all that vegetation, the rain comes, the snow, that runoff then takes the soil with it into our creeks and rivers and silts up the limited spawning gravel that we have left, basically removing those areas the fish could build nests and spawn. And we predict that will increase dramatically in the little habitats that we have left in the Sierras and up around northeastern California, Lassen area. And with that, I've painted this picture of a very changing environment, and I want to introduce a couple concepts of this idea of novel ecosystems. And the first definition of a novel ecosystem is a system of abiotic and biotic and social components and their interactions. that by virtue of human influence differs from those that prevailed historically, have a tendency to self-organize and manifest these novel qualities without intensive human management. So I mentioned a couple of times, our environment's changing, our habitats are changing, and this definition, it's changing despite humans, without human management or intervention. And one of those things that we're seeing and is predicted is actually could be a positive things for fish as we move north, Alaska, Canada, that region, glaciers, snowmelt, there's a lot more flow. These river valleys that are covered in snow and move upstream, or glaciers, are melting. And while that's a huge impact to the species in those habitats, we predict that it's going to open up literally hundreds of miles of new fish spawning habitat. So the salmon in Alaska, while they're losing their habitat to the north, to the southern part, southwestern Alaska, and into northwestern Canada, is going to open up thousands of miles of new spawning habitat. And one of those challenges we face is recognizing how this environment is changing and how we can take advantage of those opportunities. And as these new habitats are created, allow those fish to migrate to those new habitats and establish themselves. And again, these are novel habitats in that these aren't the places where they used to spawn and they used to survive, but the species will persist. And a second definition of that is very similar, but producing these novel habitats, these novel systems, through habitat enhancement and management. And through that, we can provide many of the biophysical conditions that fish and wildlife need to thrive and be abundant. And again, it's not the same habitats they were in or that they evolved in, but through management, through manipulation of the habitat, we can provide those things for them. And I want to give you an example of that. I'm here in the Central Valley. Poudre Creek is a creek that runs basically from the Sacramento River to the northwest, and historically had a pretty good fall run of Chinook salmon. And then between 1953 and 1957, a dam was built along Poudre Creek, just west of Winters, city of Winters, and formed Lake Berryessa. At that point, basically the salmon run stopped, and over time, no salmon were detected in the creek again. And then in 1990, through the efforts of some researchers at UC Davis and local folks with the Poudre Creek Council, they said, let's do some major spawning habitat rehabilitation. You can see here, they dug out, they widened the creek, dug it out. You can see where this excavator's sitting. They're creating a bench of habitat. This would be some of those off-channel habitats. So fish could get up there, get out of the flow and feed. And then in these shallow areas, bring in a bunch of gravel, a bunch of spawning rocks for the fish to deposit their eggs on. And took about a 3-mile section in different areas and created a really good spawning habitat for these fish. The one problem they had is that they still didn't have the water. And so it took 10 years of legal battles, but 10 years later, in 2000, a lawsuit was finally won to provide water from Lake Berryessa. This is the dam, Monticello Dam. You see at the bottom, there's the opportunity to release cold water there and change the flows in Poudre Creek. So lawsuit was won, and water operations were developed to benefit salmon runs in the creek. Despite the fact, again, salmon hadn't been seen there for decades, but the habitat work was done. The water was changed to produce that cold water, to produce more flow at the right times of year. And the salmon started coming back. In 2013, 8 salmon were counted. In 2014, there was 200 counted, and a year later, there was 1,500 to 1,700 spawning salmon in the creek. And the map to the left there, you can see the areas where they actually did that work. So not a huge area, but through management of water, enhancing the habitat, and you know, really manipulating things. It's not, again, it's not what it was historically. This is the result of management and direct water operations, but we're able to bring back salmon. And one of the things we were curious about is where these salmons came from. And salmon, um, from a research standpoint, we're fortunate their eyes grow basically in layers, almost like layers of an onion. And through that, we can look at their chemical signatures when it's growing, if you will. And looking at these fish that came to Puda Creek, we saw that they came from at least 7 different sources, overwhelmingly from hatcheries, but from a whole different basins, from the American River to the Merced River hatchery to Mokelumne River, Feather River. Basically, throughout the entire Central Valley, fish made their way back to Puda Creek and essentially created a new novel run of salmon. Again, this is not the same salmon that used this creek. Genetic strains. This is a very different genetic strain. It's largely hatchery fish from different hatcheries, but created its own run. And in the face of these challenges we face with climate change, this is a viable option to keep fish going. Again, it's not technically the same run or the same genetic mixture of fish, but there's salmon in the creek. It's providing ecological benefit. It's providing fishing opportunities. It's salmon there. So with that, kind of summarizing these climate change predictions on salmon and really for our native fish in general in California, it's higher average temperatures, both day and night, sea level rise with increased salinity, longer lasting droughts, with that, more intense wildfire, stronger, more extreme storms, and again, that shifting seasonal temperatures and rainfall patterns. So yeah, our environment, our climate is changing, and our challenge is how do we provide enough opportunity for these fish to adapt to that and take advantage both of new habitats, and how do we manage and create more habitats for them. So those direct impacts from climate change on salmon in particular, the higher and lower stream flows will be destroying nests and feeding habitats and washing away young fish. Again, there won't be those habitats off-channel habitats for them to get away from flow, to hide from predators, just getting washed downstream. The increased salt water in our rivers will kill plants in the food for fish. These are freshwater plants and freshwater aquatic invertebrates that can't tolerate higher salinities. The more intense wildfire will lead to soil erosion and increase the silt in the river, destroying those nesting habitats. And the shifting seasonal temperatures and rainfall patterns will lead to increased river temperatures, killing young fish and eggs. And I say that really captures it when we talk of our native fish that we have left in the Central Valley and in the state. They all need different varieties of that. And our impacts of climate change are summarized really in those 4 or 5 bullets. And again, the key with that is this is a best guess, given we don't know how people are going to respond to it, how societies and countries are going to respond to these changes in climate and these impacts that we're already seeing. And that would be what both reduced emissions that are causing climate change, as well as technological advancements. There's a lot of uncertainty around that. But the one thing that is sure is that they're going to impact fish, and the habitats are going to change in many ways. And I tend to be a little more positive in the face of these challenges, and that as I showed a couple of examples, that habitats will be lost and others will be created, and we can take advantage of that. There's going to be winners and there's going to be losers in climate change, and we need to be able to respond to that, be nimble and flexible, if you will, as scientists, biologists, as habitat restoration practitioners. We need to have all our tools in our toolbox to respond in ways that we can't predict right now, but to be able to take advantage of these changes. And also, like on Poudre Creek, build and manage habitats to really help reduce those negative impacts. And we're doing that more and more. And that's my summary, and happy to take any questions. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. That was very, very informative and really interesting. There was one question in the chat. I wonder if you could just explain what anadromous means. And if I can add up my own little question to tag on to that, I just wonder, I mean, physiologically, it's kind of amazing that salmon go from freshwater to saltwater. And I would imagine that those estuary habitats in particular are critical for sort of that adjustment, and loss of those habitat, I would imagine, would affect maybe that sort of time to sort of adjust between those two different environments.
Yes, very much so. Yeah. So I'm sorry. Yeah. Anadromous means these fish that are going either from freshwater, migrating to saltwater, spending the life in saltwater, and coming back up to freshwater to spawn. So anadromous is that actual action of moving from freshwater to saltwater. And yes, we're just starting to understand the physiological challenges a fish has to spend. They say some of our salmon are spending 3, 4, 5 years in the ocean and then coming into fresh water. And yes, they more and more evidence that they need these estuaries with some freshwater input from our rivers to kind of adjust to that, to adjust physiologically. It's kind of a trigger to them over the course of sometimes 2, 3, 4 weeks, sometimes 2 months. Fish have been seen in these estuaries, kind of getting used to, if you will, what seems to us on the outside of getting used to fresh water before they move in. And so, yeah, in the light of sea level rise in particular, and with that increased salinity, we're going to lose a lot of those habitats. And a lot of our coastal estuaries and bays really don't have anywhere to migrate. There's no habitat. As they get higher, they run into roads and cities and development. There's no real habitat for them to migrate into. So really a huge impact that we're just starting to get the science behind to understand.
Jovita, you had your hand up first, and then we'll go to Carter.
Yeah, thank you, Cliff. I just have a comment before I ask the question, and that is many of our students are from Southern California, and I do recall or know that there is a run of steelhead in sort of like the Malibu Mountains or the Malibu Lagoon area. They come in from the Pacific, and they took down a dam in the lower hills of Santa Monica Mountains to allow the fish to migrate. So I just want our Southern California students to know that although Cliff focused on the Northern California and parts north, that there was once a very active, thriving steelhead run, which is hopefully gradually returning. But my question is, the other thing that California Envirothon wants to have our students learn about is legislation and governance, the agencies that are responsible for protecting fish and wildlife. My question is, I know that the coho and the chinook are listed as either endangered or threatened under the Endangered Species Act. So my question to you is two-part. how has the Endangered Species Act, either federal and or state, leveraged protections for the fish with the dam operations, with temperatures for releases of water and pumping through the Delta? And do you foresee that the Endangered Species Act may be a tool or vehicle to protect our fish during climate change effects?
Great question. And let me, before I dive into the Endangered Species Act question, yeah, I want to echo the steelhead in Southern California. And the organization I work for, California Trout, we're working very hard right now up around the Ventura area, the Ventura River, Matilahaw Dam. The removal of Matilahaw Dam would open up many miles of steelhead spawning habitat. And there's a couple other opportunities in the region in Southern California to really bring back steelhead populations. And I think that's in the face of climate change, we need that diversity. We need fish in different areas. That some of the models for Southern California suggest more rainfall in the coastal regions. And so those habitats will become even more important for salmon and steelhead. So yeah, no, lots going on there. So endangered species, I wish that would be something that could be summarized easily and quickly, but really the listing of these species brought to it government funding and a real focus on what these species needed to prevent extinction. And with that came a whole bunch of regulations on how water is used, the pumping. I talked about the fish and eggs dying in the Sacramento River. There are regulations now in place where the Bureau of Reclamation has to release water out of Shasta to keep the upper Sacramento River cold enough that those fish don't die. Some years, like last year, there just simply wasn't enough water in the system to keep it cold enough. And so, yeah, I think in general, the listing has been a benefit to draw attention to salmon. The real drawback of the Endangered Species Act is that it focuses on preventing that species from going extinct instead of what's wrong with the entire system that the species got there. Salmon aren't the only ones declining in the habitat, and it doesn't focus on those ecosystem issues and those bigger problems. And one of the things we've been pushing for, and a lot of the agency staff recognize it, is really moving to a more system approach to recovering these species. And I think that will be how we handle these things against climate change, looking at that entire system, the suite of species. And the problem with water, as we kind of alluded to before this meeting started, is that it's just too darn political. There's too much money involved. There's too much political power in Southern California to keep water flowing from Northern California there, despite the fact that there's overwhelming scientific evidence that it's hurting our fish populations and that entire ecosystem. Delta smelt have been the species of fish that are really the one that have got all the attention from that. And again, they were one species of, we've got about 15 native fish in the Delta region, this region where the Sacramento River and San Joaquin River come together between Sacramento and San Francisco. And we've got, all of them are declining. That whole system is in trouble. And again, the Endangered Species Act has done a really poor job at addressing the entire system. But the agencies, to their credit, state Fish and Wildlife, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, have really come together to try to work on a system level and identify those things that need to take place. But again, it's the politics that's prevented it.
Yeah, I just want to say you're absolutely right, and I think it's a very political and complex and dense issue and very vexing. But I think you really addressed the nut of it in just the few minutes you had. So thank you.
Yeah.
Let's see, Carter, you had a question? And then we'll go to.
So I know I've been reading, you were talking a lot about, like releasing water to lower temperatures, creating those walking wetland floodplains. Which also did mention that just some years there isn't enough water to be able to do that, like political pressure aside. Like, what's the answer during those years to preserve the salmon population?
Carter, that's a great question, and one that I think the politics is going to get in the way of us actually implementing very quickly. But we need to come up with more creative ways to store water. We need to take a year like this year, where we're getting this last month, we've got a ton of rainfall. We really don't have the system in place to capture that excess water, if you will. Um, Whether that's off-stream storage, not new reservoirs, but off-stream storage, ability to transfer that water so that we get increased groundwater storage, replenish our groundwater capabilities. There's a number of creative ways that we have to respond from year to year as these rainfall patterns shift. We might have 2 years ago we had a really wet December. Oh, and in early October we got a bunch of rain. We've got to be able to capture that water and store it in ways other than what we have right now, these dams and reservoirs, and then have that system in place to be able to move it to protect our fish and to go to agriculture and urban uses as well. And there's lots of people working on this, and I think in the next 2 years we'll have a really good blueprint of how to do that. And again, it'll be the politics of whether we can get that to happen.
All right, cool. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Shauna, you had a question. Go ahead.
I have 2 questions for you guys. First of all, can increased flooding in the Central Valley help the salmon by expanding habitat?
I'll say yes. I think what would happen and what is starting to happen is the potential for increased flooding, higher flows more often in the Sacramento River in particular, and San Joaquin River, is really forcing the hand with agencies and politicians to recognize what we've been saying for the last 20 years, is that we need more floodplain habitat and more wetland habitat to move. Our rivers have levees on them to shoot the water out as quickly as possible, but to move those levees back, to create more space for the water, to provide more buffer between the water and agriculture and urban areas. And that in turn is the habitats that our fish and wildlife need. So I think, yes, I think we will get there by really creating more floodplain and more floodplain habitats as a result of that, to prevent flooding. And we've seen that in other parts of the country in the wake of Hurricane Katrina in the Gulf in Louisiana, that area. The political response agencies have been pushing forever, the environmentalists, to create more habitat. And as a result, now there's a ton more wetland habitat. River levees have been set back. There's more opportunity for the river to flood without flooding urban areas. And the benefits to fish and wildlife the last 4 or 5 years have been tremendous there. So I think, yes, we're getting there.
And I have one other question. Do hatchery fish cause any problems with wild salmon?
That's a good question. Yes and no. Hatchery fish, well, historically, our hatcheries, if you will, they kind of just grew the fish to a certain size. They got to a certain size where they thought their survival was good enough, and they put them in the river and off they went. And what they ended up producing over decades of doing that were, if you will, really dumb fish that didn't have the ability to survive, that didn't have the ability to navigate their environment. And studies were done in the last 10, 15 years to really show that. And the result, our hatcheries have changed, I'll say dramatically, to really try to diversify the fish that they have, that they spawn, and release them in different areas. So they're not just releasing them when they get to the right size, but timing that when flows are right, when flooding would occur, and in some cases moving them through areas where they might not make it. So some of our fish, say in the Sacramento and American rivers, they would spawn there. They'll truck them basically to San Francisco Bay so that they survive all that gauntlet of predators and non-native fish. And what they've created now is a much more diverse run. And I think I think there's growing evidence that that diversity of our hatchery fish is actually going to help us in the face of these changing climate change conditions, where we'll have a diversity of genetic stock, if you will, that can respond to different and varying environments. So hatcheries have improved dramatically. They've still got more to do, and we're working very closely with them to do that.
This is Savita. I want to add a comment, and Cliff, I would like you to let me know your thoughts. I remember studies that said that in improving hatchery stock, that they find the eggs from the watershed for raising in a hatchery. So there is that genetic pattern in the fish. So they know they're sort of like their imprint and their smell of the water for where they go out and then come back in to spawn. Is that, do I have that right?
Yes, for the most part, yes. But that would be, if you will, say the average. And then there's a whole lot of variation around that. And like that Poudre Creek example that I showed, where we created this new novel habitat and we got 11 different genetic strains show up there. So there's a lot of variation out there because these fish are very, very dynamic. If you think of California historically, the floods were much bigger, much more dynamic, prolonged drought periods, and these fish were able to survive that by taking advantage of an abundance of different habitat types and moving way inland into the mountains or staying out in the ocean longer. So they have a ton of diversity in them already, and we're just starting to understand that.
Okay, thanks.
I see there was another question in the chat. How have lawsuits by environmental groups and others moved the needle?
I would argue that they've moved the needle both directions. Lawsuits like that example I gave of Poudre Creek, where it forced the hands of agencies to release water to do what was right for fish, have been tremendous benefits. And we've seen that throughout the state, throughout the West, lawsuits pushing people to manage water more effectively. At some point, I would argue that it's gone too far. And we can look at that where folks rebelled on the other side of political spectrum with the definition of what a wetland is. And that's gone to the Supreme Court now, 3 times in the last 15 years, what the definition of a wetland is, and we can't even, from a regulatory standpoint, then can't even get to figuring out what that is and how we protect it. And in the meantime, we're losing habitat and people are getting frustrated with conservation. And as much as, it's an us against them, if you will, I've worked with a number of very prominent real estate developers. And while I don't like to see them destroying habitat, when they step up and provide 300 million for habitat conservation somewhere else, that can be a huge benefit if done correctly. Again, it might not be the same habitat we had, but we have the opportunity to protect a lot of habitat. So I think one of the things that's really been missing from the environmental group standpoint is finding that balance, finding that in-between route where California is going to continue to grow. We can't stop that. So working with folks effectively to provide conservation and allow some growth.
Yeah, and I just point out that if anybody remembers from the last webinar that Mr. Feldheim was with, that there was a bit of a discussion about how the rice farmers are providing habitat for salmon. So I think that it seems like what I'm seeing more and more is that there's more cooperation between the nonprofits and the farmers, and like you were talking about, the developers, finding ways that we can work more collectively together. And I think that's the solution.
Yeah, I agree.
Do we have one? Yeah, I just have one question, unless any of the students have one before I pose this, if we have time.
Go ahead. Any students have any more questions? Go ahead, Ovita.
Okay, I like your explanation about novel ecosystems, and like how rice farmers have provided more habitat. from our migrating birds and fisheries. My question is, has there been advancing or promoting the use of beavers to restore habitat like wetlands and create the slowing of water and colder water for the fish to have their nurseries or to rest before they continue their spawning migration or the migration to the ocean?
Yes, actually, a tremendous amount just in the last few years. There's some work in the Pacific Northwest that really showed the benefits of beavers, and that got things going. And in our state, actually, just this last year, our state Fish and Wildlife has hired 2 full-time positions, a brand new program to look at where they can reintroduce beavers, where beavers can have a positive impact, and the things that they can do for beavers. And I think we'll see in the next 7 to 10 years a big push towards those, shall we say, nature-based solutions. And that, recognizing again that we've lost a lot of that habitat diversity in the way we manage our rivers and streams to just get water out, or in the Sierras from all the mining, the hydraulic mining has ruined all the spawning habitat, washed away the hillsides. These beavers can bring back a lot of that diversity and do it, if you will, in a way that doesn't require any environmental permitting, doesn't require, the 10 years of permitting it would take for Russ or I to do that work.
That's great, because something that we have placed in the problem-solving scenario is for the students to consider nature-based solutions. And certainly beavers are one part of the solution there.
Yeah. No, I look forward to seeing how that progresses, and how we can use management and habitat enhancement to really create those ideal situations for beavers to take off in the right areas.
Right on. Beaver believer. Thank you, Cliff.
Yeah.
Indeed. Are there any more questions? We're just a few minutes past 2, but just want to give everybody an opportunity before we sign off if you have any more questions. If not, I really want to thank you once again, Cliff. This was a fantastic presentation, very interesting. Definitely, a lot of challenges, but I think, like you said, there's also, I think, some nature's resilient, and learning about kind of new novel habitats and whatnot is quite fascinating. So thank you very much for this presentation.
Yeah, you're welcome. Again, thank you for the opportunity. I look
Have a
forward
good
to
Easter.
more of it. Yeah.
We'll have
Yes,
you.
happy
We'll
Easter.
have you back in 2024
Very good.
for sure. Take care.
Indeed.
Yeah,
Thank
bye.
you all.
Thank you, Russell.